The crying started somewhere over the Atlantic, 2 hours into what was supposed to be a 14-hour flight to Singapore. At first, it was just sniffling, the kind of sound that makes passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats and pretend they don't notice. But within minutes, it escalated into full, breathless sobs that echoed through the business class cabin like an alarm no one could silence. The boy couldn't have been older than 7, small for his age, with sandy brown hair that stuck up in the back and a wrinkled t-shirt decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. He sat in seat 6 amperes, pressed against the window, his whole body shaking as tears streamed down his flushed cheeks. His hands moved frantically in the air, fingers twisting and gestures sharp, almost violent in their urgency. Again and again, the same motions, over and over. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. But no one understood what he was trying to say. In seat 6B, just inches away, sat a man in his early 40s. Expensive watch, tailored button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Laptop open on the tray table in front of him, screen glowing with spreadsheets and email chains. He had the kind of face that belonged in boardrooms and business magazines. Sharp jawline, tired eyes, the look of someone who had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and too much coffee. Richard Chen didn't look at his son, not when the crying started, not when it grew louder, not even when the boy reached over and tugged weakly at his father's sleeve, those frantic hand movements becoming more desperate. Richard just kept typing. A flight attendant approached, her smile professional but strained. She leaned down, voice low. "Sir, is everything all right? Is there anything we can do to help your son?" Richard barely glanced up. "He's fine. He does this sometimes. Just ignore it." The attendant's smile faltered. "Sir, he seems very distressed. Perhaps if we—" "I said he's fine." Richard's tone left no room for discussion. He returned his attention to the laptop screen, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The flight attendant straightened, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to disgust. She walked away, but not before exchanging a pointed look with her colleague near the galley. Passengers in nearby rows craned their necks, whispering to each other. A woman across the aisle shook her head slowly, her judgment written plainly on her face. The boy's crying grew worse. His hands never stopped moving. Sign after sign after sign, thrown desperately into the air between him and his father, a language spoken to someone who refused to listen. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Richard ordered a scotch. He put in his noise-canceling headphones. The bright blue light of the screen reflected off his face as the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight. All around him, passengers settled in with blankets and neck pillows, trying to sleep despite the heartbreaking sounds coming from 6 amperes. But the boy didn't stop, couldn't stop. At 45 minutes, a businessman in row 7 stood up and walked forward. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and a stern expression. He stopped beside Richard's seat and cleared his throat loudly. Richard looked up, annoyed, pulling one headphone off his ear. "Your kid has been crying for almost an hour," the man said, voice tight with restrained anger. "Are you going to do something about it or just sit there?" Richard's jaw clenched. "I'm handling it." "Doesn't look like you're handling anything except your emails. He's my son. I know what he needs." "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, what he needs is a father who gives a damn." The cabin went very quiet. Even the boy's crying seemed to soften for a moment, as if he sensed the confrontation happening beside him. Richard closed his laptop slowly. He turned in his seat to face the businessman fully, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and controlled. "You don't know anything about me or my son, so I suggest you go back to your seat and mind your own business." The businessman stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head in disgust and walked back to row 7, muttering something under his breath about people who shouldn't have kids. Richard put his headphones back on, opened his laptop, started typing again. And the boy kept crying. That's when Emma noticed. She was sitting in seat 7C, across the aisle and 1 row back. 9 years old, traveling alone as an unaccompanied minor on her way to visit her aunt in Singapore. The flight attendants had checked on her 3 times already, making sure she had everything she needed, that she wasn't scared. But Emma wasn't scared. She'd flown alone before. Her parents were both deaf, and she'd grown up navigating a world that most kids her age couldn't begin to understand. She'd been trying to watch a movie on the seatback screen, but she couldn't focus. Not with that sound, not with those hands. Because Emma could read what the boy was signing, and what she saw made her stomach twist into knots. She watched those small hands forming words in the dim cabin light. Watched them repeating the same phrases over and over, growing sloppier and more frantic as exhaustion set in. Watched the father ignore every single one. Emma looked around the cabin, at the passengers pretending to sleep, at the flight attendants whispering by the galley, at the businessman in row 7 who'd already tried and failed to intervene. No one else understood. No one else could help. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The flight attendant who'd been assigned to watch her, a young woman named Jessica, immediately noticed. "Sweetie, where are you going? Do you need something?" Emma pointed toward row 6. "That boy. He's deaf. He's signing. I can understand him." Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to something like relief. "You know sign language? My parents are deaf. I've been signing since I was a baby." Jessica glanced toward row 6, where the crying continued unabated. She bit her lip, clearly weighing her options. Technically, she wasn't supposed to let Emma wander the cabin unsupervised. But technically, a child had been in distress for nearly an hour with no resolution in sight. "Okay," Jessica said quietly. "But I'm coming with you." They walked up the aisle together. Emma's heart was pounding. She'd never done anything like this before, never inserted herself into a stranger's problems. But those hands kept moving in her peripheral vision, and she couldn't ignore what they were saying. Not when she was maybe the only person on this plane who could understand. They stopped beside row 6. Jessica touched Richard's shoulder gently. He pulled off his headphones again, irritation flashing across his face. "Sir, this young lady says she knows sign language. She thinks she might be able to help communicate with your son." Richard looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time. She was small, with dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and serious eyes that seemed too old for her face. "That's not necessary," Richard said. "He's just tired. He'll settle down eventually." "Sir, it's been almost an hour. I'm aware of how long it's been." Richard's voice had an edge now. "I appreciate the offer, but we're fine." Emma wasn't looking at Richard anymore. She was looking at the boy in 6 amperes, whose red-rimmed eyes had found hers. His hands had stilled for the first time since the crying began. He was staring at her with something that looked like desperate hope, and then his hands started moving again. But this time, they were signing directly to her. Emma's eyes widened. Her face went pale. Jessica noticed immediately. "What? What is he saying?" Emma didn't answer. She was frozen, watching the boy's hands form words that made her chest tighten and her eyes sting with tears she didn't fully understand. "Sweetie?" Jessica prompted gently. "What is he signing?" Emma finally tore her gaze away from the boy and looked at Richard, the father who'd been ignoring his son for an hour. The father who sat there with his expensive watch and his important emails while his child fell apart beside him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough that passengers in the surrounding rows could hear. "He's not asking for an iPad. He's not throwing a tantrum." Richard's expression shifted slightly. Something uncertain flickered behind his eyes. Emma took a breath. "He's been signing the same thing over and over for the past hour. Do you want to know what it is?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the engine noise faded into background static. Jessica's hand rested protectively on Emma's shoulder. The businessman in row 7 was leaning forward in his seat. The woman across the aisle had abandoned all pretense of sleep. Richard stared at Emma, then at his son, whose hands had gone still again, waiting. "What?" Richard's voice came out rougher than he probably intended. "What has he been saying?" Emma looked at the boy one more time. His eyes were pleading with her, begging her to make his father understand. She turned back to Richard, and what she said next would change everything. Emma's hands were shaking slightly as she lifted them, mirroring the signs the boy had been making for the past hour. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, translating gesture into words that everyone could understand. "He's signing, 'Please tell Daddy I'm sorry.'" The cabin remained silent. Richard's face didn't change. He just stared at Emma like she'd spoken in a foreign language he couldn't quite process. "Sorry for what?" Richard asked. His voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like confusion. Emma watched as the boy's hands started moving again. Faster now, more urgent. She followed along, her own expression growing more distressed with each passing second. "He's saying, Emma paused, swallowing hard. He's saying he's sorry he couldn't hear her. He's sorry he was sleeping. He's sorry he didn't wake up when she needed him. Richard's face had gone completely white. Stop. But Emma couldn't stop. The boy's hands kept signing, and the words kept coming, and she couldn't leave them trapped in silence when she was the only one who could give them voice. He's saying he's sorry Mommy fell and he didn't hear her calling. He's sorry Daddy found her alone. He's sorry that— I said stop. Richard's voice cracked. He wasn't looking at Emma anymore. He was staring at his laptop screen, but his hands had frozen on the keyboard. His whole body had gone rigid. The boy in 6 amperes was crying harder now, but differently. Not the desperate, breathless sobs from before. These were quieter, deeper. The kind of crying that comes from a place so far down that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid it. Jessica's grip on Emma's shoulder tightened. Sir, I think maybe— You don't understand. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. He still hadn't looked at his son. You don't understand what you're talking about. Then help me understand, Emma said. There was something fierce in her voice now, something that didn't quite fit her 9-year-old frame. Because he thinks it's his fault. He thinks that's why you won't look at him anymore. That got Richard's attention. His head snapped toward Emma, eyes sharp. What did you say? Emma's hands moved again, following the boy's signs. He's saying Daddy used to smile. Daddy used to play cars on the floor. Daddy used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings shaped like dinosaurs. But now Daddy only works. Now Daddy keeps his headphones on. Now Daddy looks everywhere except at him. A woman in row 5 made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The businessman in row 7 had his hand over his mouth. Even Jessica looked like she might cry. Richard finally turned to look at his son. Daniel was staring back at him with red, swollen eyes. His hands had gone still again, resting in his lap. He looked utterly exhausted, defeated, like he'd been trying to scale an impossible wall for months and had finally accepted that he'd never make it to the top. Daniel, Richard said. His voice broke on the name. The boy's eyes widened slightly. It had been so long since his father had said his name like that. Like it meant something. Like it hurt. Richard opened his mouth to say something else, but nothing came out. He looked lost, trapped, like a man drowning in the middle of the ocean with no idea which way was up. Emma wasn't finished. The boy's hands had started moving again, and she could see he was building towards something he'd been trying to say for a very long time. He's saying his grandmother told him something. Emma's voice was quieter now, gentler. She said it's hard for you to look at him because he has his mother's face, her eyes, her smile. He's saying he wishes he looked different. He wishes he looked like you instead, so maybe you could love him again. That did it. Whatever wall Richard had built around himself, whatever fortress he'd constructed out of work, emails, and noise-canceling headphones and deliberate avoidance, it crumbled. He made a sound that might have been his son's name, or might have been something else entirely. His hand reached out, shaking, hovering in the air between them like he'd forgotten how to bridge that small distance. Daniel watched his father's hand. He didn't move toward it. He just watched, waiting to see if it would be pulled away like it had been so many times before. The businessman in row 7 stood up again, but this time he didn't look angry. He looked shattered. Jesus Christ, he muttered, sitting back down heavily. His own eyes were wet. Emma felt Jessica's hand trembling on her shoulder. The flight attendant was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched the scene unfold. There's more, Emma said softly. He's not done. Richard looked at her, and for the first time since this whole interaction began, she could see he was terrified. Terrified of what else his son had been trying to tell him. Terrified of how much he'd missed. Terrified of what he'd become. Emma's hands moved with Daniel's, and her voice stayed steady even as her own eyes filled with tears. He's asking if you know what day it is. Richard's brow furrowed. He glanced at his watch, at his laptop screen where the date sat in the corner. It's the 15th. August 15th. Emma shook her head slowly. He wants to know if you know what that means. Richard stared at the date on his screen. August 15th. The 15th of August. He'd been so deep in work, so buried in meetings and deadlines and anything that would keep his mind occupied, that he hadn't even— His face crumpled. Oh God. It came out as a whisper. Oh God. It's her birthday. The cabin was so quiet that the engine noise seemed deafening by comparison. Passengers who'd been pretending not to listen had given up all pretense. A man in row 8 was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. The woman across the aisle had her hand pressed to her mouth. Daniel's hands moved again, and Emma translated, her voice thick with emotion. He made something for Mommy's birthday. He's been working on it for weeks. He wanted to show you on the plane because he thought maybe, if he reminded you that today was special, you might talk to him again, really talk to him. Not just tell him to be quiet or go to his room or stop bothering you while you're working. Richard's hand finally closed the distance. It landed on Daniel's shoulder, gripping perhaps a bit too tight, like he was afraid the boy might disappear if he didn't hold on. Where? Richard's voice was hoarse. Where is it? What did you make? Daniel's hand signed something, and Emma translated. It's in his backpack, under the seat. Richard practically lunged for the backpack, pulling it out from under 6 amperes with shaking hands. He unzipped it clumsily, pulling out an iPad, a package of goldfish crackers, a stuffed elephant that looked well-loved and slightly worn, and then a piece of paper, folded into careful quarters. Richard's hands stilled on it. He didn't unfold it right away. He just held it, staring at the creased white paper like it might explode. Open it, Emma said quietly. He wants you to see it. Around them, the cabin had become an audience to something far too intimate for a public space. But no one looked away. No one could. Richard's fingers fumbled with the folds. Once, twice, 3 times. And then the paper was open, spread across his lap, where the laptop had been just minutes before. It was a drawing, done in crayons and colored pencils, with the kind of careful attention that only a child who really, truly cares about something can manage. 3 stick figures held hands in the center of the page. A woman with long yellow hair and a blue dress, a man with brown hair and a tie, a small boy between them with a huge smile. Hearts floated around all 3 of them, red and pink and purple. The sun shone in the corner, impossibly yellow and bright. At the top of the page, in careful block letters that had clearly taken a long time to form, Happy Birthday Mama, I miss you, love Daniel. And at the bottom, in smaller letters, like an afterthought or a confession that had to be added, Daddy, I'm sorry. Richard made a sound that didn't seem human. It was the sound of something breaking that had been cracked for months but had finally, irreversibly shattered. The drawing shook in his hands. Tears fell on it, smudging the blue of the woman's dress slightly. I'm sorry, Richard whispered to the paper, to the drawing, to his son, to the ghost of his wife. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. He turned to his son, still holding the drawing like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because maybe it was. Daniel was watching him with an expression that was almost hopeful. Almost. But there was caution there, too. The wariness of a child who'd been disappointed too many times to fully trust hope anymore. Richard reached for him. And this time, Daniel didn't pull away. He let himself be pulled into his father's arms, his small body folding against Richard's chest as months of loneliness and confusion and guilt finally found somewhere to land. Richard held his son and cried in a way he probably hadn't since the funeral. Maybe not even then. Maybe he'd been too busy being strong, being the adult, being the one who had to hold everything together. Maybe he'd never let himself fall apart. Until now, at 30,000 feet, surrounded by strangers, holding a drawing that said everything he'd been too afraid to hear. Emma stepped back, giving them space. Jessica's hand squeezed her shoulder gently, and when Emma looked up, the flight attendant was smiling through her tears. You did good, sweetie, Jessica whispered. But Emma was still watching Daniel's hands, because even pressed against his father's chest, even in the middle of this long overdue embrace, the boy was still signing. And what he was signing made Emma's heart ache in a completely different way. She waited until Richard had composed himself slightly, until his breathing had evened out and he'd pulled back enough to look at his son's face. Really look at it, maybe for the first time in months. Mr. Chen, Emma said softly. Richard looked at her, his eyes red and swollen. He's still signing something. Do you want to know what it is? Richard glanced down at Daniel's hands, still moving between them, even as the boy leaned against his father's side. Yes, Richard said. Please, tell me everything. I need to know everything. Emma took a breath. This part was going to hurt worse than all the rest. She could feel it. He's asking if you know why he was crying when we took off. Back at the airport, Richard frowned, clearly trying to remember. There'd been so much to do at JFK. Security lines and gate changes and last-minute work calls. Daniel had been upset about something, but Richard had been distracted, overwhelmed, already mentally on the plane, and then the hotel, and then the meetings that waited in Singapore. "I thought he didn't want to leave," Richard said slowly. "He was crying at the gate. I figured he was nervous about the flight." Emma shook her head. "He was crying because he wanted to bring something with him. Something you said he couldn't pack because there wasn't room in the luggage." Richard's expression went blank. "I don't remember." "A photo album," Emma said. "The one with pictures of his mother. He wanted to bring it because he thought maybe if you looked at her pictures together, you might remember the good parts. You might smile when you thought about her, instead of looking sad and angry all the time. But you said no. You said there wasn't room. You said he needed to move on." The words landed like physical blows. Richard actually flinched. "He's saying he knows you're sad. He knows you miss her too. He's saying he wishes he could make it better. He wishes he could bring her back. He wishes—" Emma's voice cracked. She had to stop and collect herself before she could continue. "He wishes he could trade places with her. He thinks maybe if he was the one who died, you'd be happier. Because then you'd still have her, and you wouldn't have to look at her face in his and remember everything you lost." The cabin wasn't silent anymore. People were openly crying now. The businessman in row 7 had his head in his hands. The woman across the aisle was sobbing into her husband's shoulder. Even the flight attendants by the galley were wiping their eyes. Richard was shaking his head over and over, like he could physically reject the words Emma was speaking. "No. No, that's not Daniel. That's not true. That's not what I—" But he couldn't finish. Because maybe it was true, in a way. Not the part about wishing Daniel was dead. Never that. But the part about not being able to look at him. The part about running away into work and distance and anything that didn't remind him of what he'd lost. The part about failing his son every single day for 6 months and not even realizing it until a 9-year-old girl on an airplane forced him to see. Daniel's hands had stopped moving. He was watching his father with those 2 old eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. Waiting to see if this moment of connection would last, or if his father would put the headphones back on and return to the laptop and leave him alone again with his guilt and his grief and his desperate, unanswered apologies. Richard made a decision. He closed the laptop, didn't just set it aside, actually closed it and pushed it under the seat in front of him, out of reach. Then he turned to Emma. "Can you teach me?" His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "Can you teach me what he's saying? What I should say back?" Emma blinked in surprise. "You want to learn sign language? Now? We have 12 more hours on this flight," Richard said. "I've wasted 6 months. I'm not wasting another second." Emma sat between them for the next 10 hours, her hands moving in patient repetition as she taught Richard the language his son had been speaking all along. The first sign was simple. 3 fingers extended, thumb crossing the palm. "I love you." Richard's hand shook as he copied the gesture. He turned to Daniel and signed it. Once, twice, 3 times. Like he was trying to make up for all the times he should have said it but didn't. Daniel's face transformed. The wariness melted into something that looked like relief, like hope, like a weight he'd been carrying finally lifting. Emma showed Richard how to sign "It's not your fault." Richard's fingers fumbled through it twice before he got it right. When he finally signed it to Daniel, the boy started crying again. But these tears were different. Cleaner somehow. Other passengers began helping. A woman in row 8 knew basic ASL from a college course. She showed Richard the sign for beautiful and mother, and how to say, "You look like her, and that makes me happy, not sad." The businessman from row 7 brought them water and snacks. "I'm sorry," he said quietly to Richard. "I didn't understand." "You understood better than I did," Richard replied. By hour 5, Richard could sign full sentences. By hour 8, he and Daniel were having actual conversations. Slow, clumsy on Richard's part, but real. Emma taught him how to sign Saturday pancakes and dinosaurs, and "I'm here now." She taught him "forgive me," and "I was wrong," and "you are not broken." Flight attendants gave them extra blankets and privacy. Other passengers smiled when they walked past and saw father and son sitting close, hands moving between them in a language that was becoming less foreign with every passing mile. As they began their descent into Singapore, Daniel pulled out a small notebook. He wrote something and showed it to his father. "Can we go home and get Mama's photo album?" Richard's eyes filled again. But he was learning that tears weren't something to hide from his son. He signed yes, then wrote beneath Daniel's question, "We'll look at it together every day if you want." Daniel smiled. Actually smiled. And Richard realized he hadn't seen that smile in 6 months. When the plane landed, Emma's aunt was waiting for her at the gate. Richard asked for her mother's contact information, wrote it carefully in his phone. "I'm going to keep learning," he told Emma. "Really learning. Not just enough to get by." Emma hugged Daniel goodbye. The boy signed "Thank you" and "Friend," and something else that made Emma laugh. Jessica, the flight attendant, walked Emma to her aunt, then returned to Richard. "That little girl probably saved your son's life today. You know that, right?" Richard watched Daniel sign something about the landing, his hands animated and excited, already trying to teach his father new words. "She saved mine too," Richard said. 3 months later, Richard would step down as CEO. He'd become fluent in ASL. He'd start a foundation for hearing parents of deaf children navigating grief. He'd frame Daniel's drawing and keep it on his desk. And every Saturday, without fail, he'd make dinosaur pancakes while his son sat at the kitchen counter, both of them signing about everything and nothing, making up for lost time one conversation at a time. The plane had landed. But for Richard and Daniel Chen, the real journey was just beginning. If this story touched you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. And remember, even small acts of understanding can change someone's life forever.